Today is the second event of a series of 5. We are discussing climate change adaptation and mitigation related to local development. So, I'm Lucilene Danziger. I'm a Humphrey Fellow here. I'm from Brazil. And we, Humphrey Fellows, are not experts in climate change, but we are professionals concerned with climate change and what is going on in our countries, in our world. So the purpose here is to open a dialogue about the challenges that we are starting to face in our countries and here in the US. Also, it's important to highlight that we will have a local conference about climate change, adaptation and mitigation that will happen here in Ithaca and in Cortland to discuss these issues locally. And we are working together and we are collaborating with each other. This event will happen in late April. You all are invited to participate in this event. We will talk more about in the next events. Before we start the presentation, I would like to thank the Humphrey program and calls for the opportunity and for the support. And especially, we would like to thank the speakers that kindly accepted our invitation. Today we have 2 presentations that discuss the challenging role of the municipalities and small communities related to climate change adaptation mitigation. And Dr. Barr Dahlia will bring an instigating question for us. How can Ithaca and Tompkins County address these challenges in a way that promotes what Van Jones calls eco-equity rather than eco-apartheid? It's interesting, no? And Mr. Hamzy will reveal some of the reasons that local government action by municipalities is important and the kinds of strategies that municipalities undertake. So welcome to everyone and enjoy this event. Now I will give the word to Naditza that will present Dr. Barr Dahlia for us.
Thank you very much, Lou. It's my pleasure to introduce both speakers. First, we will see what Mr. Barr Dahlia has to say. I just asked him how to pronounce it. Dr. Peter Barr Dahlia is president of Black Oak Wind Farm, a 20 megawatts project just outside of Ithaca, slated to be in production in early 2014. Co-author of Boldly Sustainable, Hope and Opportunity for Higher Education in the Age of Climate Change. He is the coordinator of the Tompkins County Climate Protection Initiative, a multi-sector effort in the Ithaca, New York area, US, to reduce greenhouse gas emission through energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. Barr Dahlia was the provost and vice president of academic affairs from 2002 until 2007 at Ithaca College, where he helped to launch the college nationality recognized sustainability initiative. A senior advisor at Second Nature, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing the principles of sustainability in higher education. He also is a member of the Senior Council of the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education and the editor board of Sustainability, the Journal of Records. In Ithaca, Barr Dahlia serves on the board of the Museum of the Earth and advisory board of the Groundswell Center for Local Food and Farming, and he's co-founder and board vice chair of the New Roots Charter High School, an innovative secondary school that integrates sustainability and social justice across the curriculum. Barr Dahlia received his PhD and master degrees in history from Stanford University and his bachelor degree in history and English from Brown University. Now I'll give the floor to Mr. Barr Dahlia. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So as you can tell, I'm a refugee from higher education. I spent 20 years as a history professor before I went over to the dark side and became a dean, and then went on to being a provost. And so I have a very particular perspective on all this. I think you'll probably pick up on it pretty quickly. I have a number of very strong biases. I don't pretend to be objective in any way whatsoever on these issues. So let's just start there. And I should say, having been over at Ithaca College and having launched the sustainability initiative, I also have a particular perspective on Cornell. Actually, we always used to say, because South Hill is higher in elevation than East Hill, that we look down on Cornell. But we were the first to do a LEED certified building. In fact, our first LEED certified building that we did before Cornell was the first LEED Platinum certified School of Business building anywhere in the world. That was really my baby. I launched that. I raised most of the money for it, and am very proud that that is there. And actually, I think did something to spur the move on Cornell's campus to say, gee, maybe we better do LEED buildings as well. So there. I really believe that Van Jones is one of the great visionaries of our time, and I think that this framework he lays out for us is really imperative in thinking about sustainability and making it through this age of climate change and building more resilient, sustainable, and just communities. Van Jones basically says, look, this is all about building a future. We choose the future. The future isn't something that happens to us. No choice is a choice, right? And so he says we have three ways we can think about the future. We can keep headed in the way we're headed now, which is eco-apocalypse, and I don't have to tell you about that. You know, it's Thelma and Louise time, cars going right off the cliff. Will we put the brakes on or not? Remains to be seen. And he says, or we could, and this is a trend that you see developing now, especially in more developed nations, we can move toward eco-apartheid, and we can, and those with privilege and power and wealth can try to wall themselves off from the eco-apocalypse and try to insulate themselves from the worst effects of global climate change. What Jones says, and what I think is really important here, is that eco-apartheid is just a speed bump on the way to eco-apocalypse. In the end, we're all in this together, whether we want to or not. So what Jones basically says is we've really got one choice, and the choice is eco-equity, a world in which that it's not just about environmental sustainability, but it's also about economic promise and potential and opportunity, as well as social equity and justice. So I'm just going to go over this very quickly. I'm sure you're all really aware of most of this. In the Northeast, we have this issue with the ocean. In particular, it's a hot spot. The sea level is rising here faster than the global average. Scientists aren't really clear why, but what we do know is that there are planners now in New York City and in Boston, who are basically saying, look, we've got 5 to 6 feet that we have to plan for right now. And that's if things don't get any worse, which of course they could very well get worse. And the issue here, of course, is for us, is that when Lower Manhattan goes underwater, and it probably will, in spite of all the efforts of urban planners to put up all kinds of walls, their own version of eco-apartheid, where are those people going to go? There are millions of people living along the eastern coast. They're going to move inland, and they're going to move to communities like Ithaca, and we need to be prepared for that. If you feel like the winters have been warmer recently, well, that's right. They've risen on an average of 4 degrees since just 1970 alone. And precipitation amounts have increased by 3.3 inches over the last 100 years. What we've been having are more frequent big precipitation events where there's been tremendous amounts of stormwater runoff and flooding. And that's, of course, a major problem for our infrastructure. And then there's poor old Greek Peak, trying to keep alive in the age of climate change. They did get some snow this winter, finally. Last winter was a disaster. But, you know, we're going to see, and are already beginning to see, major shifts in precipitation patterns in New York. And that means less snow in the winter and less rain in the summer. And projections are up to 50% less by the end of the century. Warmer patterns, changes in precipitation involve both challenges and opportunities. The big opportunity, of course, is for the wine industry. By the end of the century, California is basically, they'll be growing raisins. They literally won't have the cool nights that they need to produce the sugar content in the grapes. This is important. I know this. My grandfather was a goat herder in the Italian Alps. My family is still there, own vineyards. They're really worried about this. I mean, they're looking at becoming North Africa. How are they going to raise premium grapes for wine? Same problem in California. Not a problem here. Go buy some land on the Cayuga Wine Trail, because we're going to start looking like Napa Valley by the end of the century. But there will be issues with increased insects, disease, and weeds, and that's going to pose some serious challenges. A lot of good research going on here at Cornell around this. So what does this mean in particular locally for planners? It means that we really are going to have to start thinking seriously about local infrastructure, about our energy grid. If we needed another reminder about the energy grid, how about that Super Bowl, huh? 35 minutes in the dark. If that wasn't a testament about the countries sitting back and going, well, somebody else will take care of the energy infrastructure, I don't know what was. I felt like Rachel Maddow ought to come out right in the middle of all that and go, we used to think about big things with the Hoover Dam behind her, saying, why don't we do something about a smart grid? But at any rate, we've got plenty of railways and roads and low-lying areas. We have issues with water treatment plants, issues with bridges, and it's really interesting because one of the things that my coalition, the Tompkins County Climate Protection Initiative, has been involved in is encouraging the planning department, which is very progressive here, very strategic in their thinking, really fortunate to have those folks in the planning department at the county level, getting them to think about what used to be called hazard mitigation plans and integrating the challenges and ideas about how to face those challenges in terms of the county planning looking forward 20 to 40 years. So the point here is that local and regional planners do need to integrate climate change trends into their comprehensive planning, not just their emergency planning. What we used to think of as emergency planning is just going to be called planning from now on. That's really the bottom line. And if we do that, and we're fortunate enough to be doing it here in Tompkins County, then communities will adapt, they will become more resilient. One thing I would argue, though, and this goes back to Van Jones's point about eco-equity, there's only one way, I'm convinced, that we're going to build more resilient communities that will thrive in the age of global warming and that will, in fact, embrace and be able to implement Van Jones's concept of eco-equity. And that's if the universities and the colleges in the community, and in this case that means Cornell University and Ithaca College as well as TC3, recognize their responsibility in being part of this conversation and being part of the commitment of resources that are necessary to build that community that's rooted in eco-equity and not eco-apartheid. We're not going to be able to get through this with Cayuga Heights isolated from downtown South Side. It's just not going to work. We'll come apart at the seams, guaranteed. So as I said, we're fortunate to have forward-looking planners in Tompkins County who are really looking at these issues and grappling with them. I do think that we've got the kinds of conversation going on with both Cornell and Ithaca College that can help accelerate this process. But there's still a lot of inertia to get over. I mean, higher education, like the Catholic Church, is really committed to the status quo. We talk about it as a transformative institution. But in fact, there's a reason why it's, the church and universities are the only institutions to have survived basically since the Middle Ages. And that's because they know how to defend themselves as institutions. And so we're going to see a lot of that going forward as well. But in the end, as I said, we're all in this together, whether we want to recognize that or not. So in terms of what's going on locally, outside the campuses, you've got Tompkins County, you have the city of Ithaca, you have the towns of Ithaca and Caroline have all committed themselves to being part of the New York State Climate Smart Communities. It's a network of communities in the state of New York that are trying to figure these issues out. And also the county got funding from NYSERDA recently to lead the implementation of the Southern Tier Cleaner Greener Plan. That's in its final stages now. That'll be getting rolled out over the rest of this year and is very likely to get additional funding from NYSERDA to implement that. So here's the key image I want you to walk away with today, okay? This is it. I don't know how many of you are fans of Lost. I was and am. I watched every single episode. Jack Shephard was the hero of that series. And he said very early on in that series, this is about a plane crash on an island in the middle of nowhere, and the survivors have to figure out how they're going to get through this and what they're going to need to do to survive. And Jack basically says, hey, we live together or we die alone. And to me, that is the key concept of the 21st century. Live together or die alone. Those are our two choices. Now, the other thing you may have heard is I, among other hats that I wear, I'm the senior advisor for Second Natures, a nonprofit in Boston that promotes sustainability in higher education. We're the folks that launched the President's Climate Commitment. Cornell's a signatory, as well as Ithaca College and TC3. And I think embedded in the concept of the President's Climate Commitment is this notion of leadership by example. Absolutely key to the success of this proposition. The understanding here is that presidents across the country, 655 institutions in all 50 states, have committed their campuses to moving towards carbon neutrality. And that in doing so, these presidents have said, first, there is a thing called climate change. 2, we need to deal with it and be part of the solution, not the problem. And 3, we can provide a leadership role. Why? Because there's 17 million students in over 4,000 institutions. This is a major economic sector, $317 billion industry. Higher ed employs millions, it spends billions, and if higher ed can't help move the country in this direction, then nobody else will. The other thing I want to point out is higher ed manages over $400 billion in endowment funds, which puts higher ed, I think, in a critical position of responsibility for thinking about its ties with the fossil fuel industry. And the example that endowment managers are setting for the students at those institutions as they continue to invest in fossil fuels, and knowing what their own scientists on the campus know, that particular industry it has more responsibility for creating this Thelma and Louise episode that we find ourselves caught in than any other industry in the country. And just so you know, if you haven't heard, students have launched a movement to get universities to divest from fossil fuels and to rechannel those investments into socially responsible companies and corporations across the country, and are also pushing for local investment. Local investment is a key part of socially responsible investing. What would happen if every US campus used 100% clean energy? It would increase the current demand for renewable energy by 4 times. It would create thousands of jobs. It would support innovation in green industries and financing options. So it's not just about divesting, it's about rechanneling that investment. Not just to Wall Street either, but to Main Street. And if every campus partnered with the local community, that would clearly dramatically increase the impact in a very positive way, would strengthen local communities and improve town-gown relations. Cornell, for example, finds itself in this traditional town versus gown kind of paradigm. Every few years they have to sit down and negotiate what the payoff is going to be to the local government to keep them off their back. Okay? It's euphemistically called payment in lieu of taxes pilot. Okay? But the fact is that it can be a very adversarial relationship and can set up exactly the opposite kind of dynamic that we need going forward. An adversarial relationship when what's needed is collaboration. And so to start thinking about investing in local community infrastructure, for example, in ways that bring a return to the university in direct dollars, and it can be done, certainly makes a lot more sense, at least to my way of thinking, than going through these ridiculous conversations about, well, how much can we get you for this year to cover, police, fire, et cetera. Why not invest in ways that create, that actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, create thousands of jobs, stimulate local business investment, et cetera. That, to me, seems to make a lot more sense. So, what about the collaborative landscape? Again, we have, I think, a very unique setting here and a really unique opportunity in terms of what we can do all together. Tompkins County Climate Protection Initiative, I launched that. As I stepped down from the provost office at Ithaca, I'd been involved in getting Ithaca College involved in a number of local initiatives around sustainability and thought that I had the ability, based on my relationships that I developed during that time, to build a coalition, and I'll talk some more about that and what we've accomplished. The Park Foundation funds thousands and thousands of dollars each year for local sustainability initiatives directly targeted at the community to increase its resiliency and its sustainability going forward. Ithaca Car Share, if you're not familiar with that, you should be. It's had great success here. There are places up here at Cornell where you can get cars and over at Ithaca College as well as downtown. And it's really a model for the country because the community did this on its own. We just said, no, we're not going to go with some outside vendor. We're going to create our own nonprofit, and we're going to run this as a locally owned operation, and it's really been very successful. Sustainable Tompkins, which really, I think, in many ways launched the local conversation and built the grassroots network that led to many other efforts, including the Tompkins County Climate Protection Initiative, has done some great work. And then the spin-offs from Sustainable Tompkins, the Green Resource Hub, the Sustainable Entrepreneurial and Entrepreneur Network have events all the time for local business leaders that are interested in moving towards sustainability. Just had a great presentation the other night from folks that are looking at energy issues and technology. Spin-off from Tatum Engineers, which was involved a Cornell engineering grad who's they've developed this new technology for air conditioning that uses geothermal. That really has the possibility of revolutionizing air conditioning, much more efficient, reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 60 to 70%. And I think that's the kind of thing that you get in a college town that you might not get elsewhere, that kind of intellectual capital that gets played out in the community and becomes a business that's employing people and that's really planning for the future. New Roots Charter High School, I was one of the co-founders of that. I'm the vice chair of the board. We basically said, look at the high schools here aren't doing the job in terms of integrating sustainability and social justice into the curriculum. We talked to the local superintendent, not the current one, tried to get this curriculum integrated in just the standard school district. They wouldn't hear any of it, so we went ahead and started this high school. It's been a major stimulus, I think, in terms of the conversation in the community, and is now widely seen both regionally and nationally as one of the most innovative approaches to secondary education in the United States. And then Groundswell Center for Local Food and Farming, another effort that I was co-founder in. I'm on the steering committee, doing some great work training the next generation of farmers. We received a major USDA grant to do that, and have used that as a basis for launching what I think is going to be a very important institution in the county as we become more and more aware of the need to build a strong, secure, and just local food system. And then Black Oak Wind Farm, which I'm the president of and helped get started. The thing I want you to know about this is we raised, for seed capital, which is the hardest money to raise, we raised $1.2 million in this community from 86 investors. I don't think there are very many other communities in the United States where you could pull that off. We now have 6-7 years of wind data. We have our long-term leases. Environmental permitting is almost wrapped up. We've negotiated our agreement for turbines. It's actually going to be more like 13 or 14 megawatts and 20 megawatts because we decided to go with a smaller turbine, less noise, less disruption to the neighbors, et cetera. And we've got plenty of support in Enfield, which has just been terrific. The community there has been really very positive about what we're trying to accomplish. So what about TikBe? Well, TikBe was launched in June 2008. And it basically says, look, we've got a community of 100,000 people. We have 3 major higher ed institutions that have signed the President's climate commitment. The previous mayor was one of the early signatories to the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. The county legislature has been a major leader on this from the get-go, even before the universities and colleges and the city. And now the towns of Caroline and Dryden and Ithaca have also jumped on board. If you want to know more about TikBe, it's easy. Just go to tccpi.org. Basic strategy of TikBe, though, is to mobilize a multi-sector coalition of local community leaders who have said, look, again, going back to the Van Jones vision, we can only do this if we do it together, only if we connect and collaborate. This is not about command and control. That vertical hierarchy, which higher ed seems to be having a hard time letting go of, is just not going to work in a post-industrial world. We need to build more horizontal networks, much like the web itself. And in doing that, then set out to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, accelerate the transition to clean energy, and increase energy efficiency, which you don't hear a lot of talk about, but actually is the most effective way to go about this work. Just energy efficiency, just for those of you who don't know, costs 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour to implement. That's cheaper than any energy out there, including natural gas. Why we aren't doing more of that beats me. It's just not very sexy is what everybody says, but there are lots of things that aren't very sexy that get a lot of money because they make money, and this is one of them, and it makes money and just hasn't attracted the kind of attention that it should. So here's what the map looks like when you think about TikBe. At the core of it was Sustainable Tompkins, Second Nature with the President's Climate Commitment, and the Park Foundation, local and national organizations. Out of this emerged several sectors. One, the education. These are just representative members. There are other folks in each of these sectors besides the ones that are listed here. The local government sector, the NGO sector, business and finance, and then finally the last one, youth. Very interesting that I'll take personal responsibility for this. Having spent 25 years in higher education, it was the last sector that came on board this coalition that I helped launch and build. Why I wasn't thinking of it? Blind spot, that's all I can say. But it was great because the youth came to us and they said, look, this is our future we're talking about. We want to be part of the solution. We should have a seat at the table. And I really applaud the coalition because they came to one of our monthly meetings, the students did, from all these various schools. There were probably about 15 of them there. And they presented their case. And the coalition unanimously voted them a seat at the table. So they have a representative who sits on the steering committee. It's actually a senior here at Cornell, Reed Steiberger, who's doing a great job. If you know of him here on campus, he is and will continue to be quite the activist around these issues. Just quickly, some examples of projects that we've launched. Tompkins Energy Conservation Corps. This was a collaboration with the Cornell Cooperative Extension Office here in Tompkins County. We got students from Ithaca College and Cornell to come together, be trained by the Cooperative Extension to go out and do informal energy audits and raise awareness among local leaders about the work they were doing. EPA Climate Showcase Community Grant was a 3-year grant received from the EPA that involves the Planning Department and Eco Village at Ithaca, which I just love that juxtaposition. That juxtaposition came out of the conversation at TikBe meetings. It really represents what we're trying to accomplish at TikBe. Eco Village at Ithaca and the County Planning Department had never sat down at the same table before, except maybe in an adversarial way, but to say, look, we've got a model community here. We need to start thinking about what we can learn from Eco Village and integrate that into our planning going forward. And then Get Your Green Back Tompkins, that was a spin-off from TikBe as well, and Energize Ithaca, the local effort to build a downtown district energy. That was also a conversation that started at TikBe as well, and then the wind farm has been a key part of the coalition. So the key here is that we engage our community members as co-creators. I know this is hard up here on East Hill and over there on South Hill to think about regular folks in the community as co-creators and not as customers or clients. But that's how this is going to have to work. As I said earlier, it is about connect and collaborate, not about command and control. You hear a lot of talk about silos everywhere. If we don't move from silos to gardens pretty soon and start thinking about ways to cross-pollinate and increase our diversity, just like the biosphere, there are going to be some issues there as well. I don't know what this drawing means. I just love it. Without collaboration, there is no creation. That is the key takeaway for you today, I hope. And that we need to build these new spaces for connection, and those new spaces for connection better involve campus and community collaboration around building a more sustainable future. So the conclusion here is very simple. Communities and campuses that work together to embrace sustainability and resilience and embed these concepts into their mission and vision and leadership, those are the communities that are going to flourish in the 21st centuries. There will be winners and losers, just as there always are, but there are going to be new winners this time, and there are going to be new losers, and there are going to be new ways of winning and new ways of losing. And this is true for the campuses as well as the communities that they're situated in. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Peter Barr Dahlia. In respect to the time, if it's acceptable for all of you, we would like to continue now with the presentation of Mr. George Hamzy, and at the end we will leave time to open a discussion and questions. Mr. George Hamzy is a PhD candidate in Cornell University's Department of City and Regional Planning. Before coming back to Cornell, George was an urban planner working with communities around New York State on issues of economic and environmental sustainability. He also spent 15 years as an environmental journalist, including as co-founder and coordinating producer of the public radio program Living on Earth. This fall, George will join the faculty of Binghamton University, where he will play an important role shaping a new sustainable communities master's degree program scheduled to launch within the next year or two. So I'll leave the floor for Mr. George now. Thank you.
So this is actually really good coordination, because we realized from this first presentation, okay, there it is, that we live in a special place here in Ithaca and in Tompkins County. Okay, and what I'm going to do is my research is interested in looking at, well, what's happening everywhere else that doesn't have 3 major universities, that doesn't have this ethic in the community. Why are people trying and starting to do these kinds of things? And so what I want to do, because there's a lot of talk in out in the world, in academic literature, out in the rest of the world, is to test this belief that the mayor of Grand Rapids, Michigan put forward to us, that cities are where it's going to be in terms of climate change, okay? That they're going to save the world one plan at a time, one initiative at a time, one strategy at a time, but make no mistake, we will save the world. So what I want to start to think about is, well, what do cities do? And I'll present that for a little bit. And then why do they do this? Which is a very, very important question when you get out of places like Tompkins County. So this is my quick agenda. I do want to talk for a second about cities in the US context, because I know we have an international audience, and also even Americans don't quite understand what the role is the city in terms of governance is, the problems, the climate problems of cities, the solutions that some of them have, and then get to my research, which is why do cities act, and then my conclusions. And that's what I hope we can start talking about, is whether or not I'm on the right path. So what is a municipality? This is what we think of most of the time. We think of Boston, New York, Chicago, Singapore, Berlin. But the reality is, in the United States, most people live in places with fewer than 100,000 people. Half of the population lives in places like Ithaca with around 25,000 people or less. They live in suburbs. They live in small towns. Okay? There are, within New York State, about 1,500 independent municipal actors. Every one of them basically has control of land use within their borders. They have control of their own municipal operations. And there's not a lot of guidance from the state, particularly on issues of climate change. Ithaca is right here, and New York City is right there for reference. But each of these little spots is an individual municipality with its own power to act. And when you take that up to the United States, okay, we've got 36,000 of these individual municipalities, and these are counties. These aren't municipalities because it wouldn't resolve it all, but there are 3,000 counties. So we have all these individual actors that we hope are doing something about climate change. Okay, so first, that's what I want to do to try and set the stage. Now, why do we care about these cities and greenhouse gases? I mean, why is this an area of study? This is a map that Arizona State University did with Purdue University, showing geographically where, within the city of Indianapolis, where climate emissions come from. The red is commercial and industrial, the green is residential, it's spread out a lot more, and then the grayish blue is transportation. So how does that play out in terms of percentages? These are 6 communities that I picked for a project I had been working on earlier, and was just trying to understand, well, where do the greenhouse gas emissions come from? And so we can see here that, for example, green is transportation, and you see places that are more spread out. Union City, California, Eugene, Oregon. They have a lot more, they spend a lot more driving, of course. And so that's where a lot of the energy goes, when a lot of greenhouse gas emissions come from, versus places like Cambridge, Massachusetts. Very dense, great transportation system. New York City, very dense, public transportation system. Okay? How does it spray out physically? So this is our typical sprawling pattern where most of Americans live. This is suburban Virginia. This is a school. This is a house where Timmy lives. Okay? This is how far Timmy should be able to walk, a half a mile, 10-minute walk. But unfortunately, in this kind of a pattern, what we have is the only way to really get there, it takes over 2 miles. And Timmy's parents don't let him walk all the way to school, because that's a 45-minute walk on streets that probably don't have a lot of sidewalks. And so this is the problem that we have within these communities. This is why the transportation number gets so high. This is the, okay, sorry, put that a little bit out of place. But anyway, you get the point. This is where you see the transportation number here as well. This is a detail from Boston, Massachusetts, of their greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see Boston Public Schools spend a lot in natural gas to heat their buildings, spend a lot in diesel busing their students from place to place. You know, you see the police or the fire department, they spend a lot in fuel and they have to heat buildings as well. These are the kinds of things, this is the kinds of places where people are starting to look at these, you know, this is where our greenhouse gas emissions come from in our communities. So, that's where it comes from. That's the city as a problem. What about the city as a solution? What kinds of things are places doing? We heard a little bit about that in Tompkins County. What about some other places? They take action in terms of mitigation and adaptation. I'm only going to talk about mitigation because that to me is the interesting global commons problem. And they have two jurisdictions. They have their municipal operations, the fire department buildings, the city hall buildings, the fire trucks. And then they have the regulation of the private sector. You know, where we put our buildings, how we do you know, our transportation systems, our public transportation. And so in Boston, Massachusetts, for example, they're retrofitting light fixtures, they're buying more fuel-efficient vehicles. You've probably heard a lot about this. They built a new police station in Roxbury. In New Haven, Connecticut, they replaced all of their streetlights and they retrofitted buildings for energy efficiency. They took this on their own to do this. In Keene, New Hampshire, a smaller place, they're experimenting with a lot like Ithaca, actually. They have Keene College there, I think it's called. They have, you know, they've been experimenting with biodiesel, facilities garage, and capturing landfill gas in order to generate power. But then we get to think about the private sector, okay? This is where most of the greenhouse gases come from because, of course, there are many more of us than there are, many more of us have cars than there are city officials who have cars. There's just more of us. So what we do is we take a look at our buildings within our communities. Boston has a requirement that over 50, if you put a new building in, if it's bigger than 50,000 square feet, it has to hit LEED certification. I won't go into what LEED is. We can talk about in the questions and answers if you don't know what it is, but essentially it's a way of rating buildings. It's an industry standard, okay? And so Boston and Washington and Los Angeles have adapted this green building standard. And this is a building in South Boston that they put together. It was the subject of a documentary called The Greening of Southie, which it's not actually that, it's not that compelling a documentary to watch. But if you like looking at buildings and seeing what things do, it might be worth fast forwarding through. This is another thing that communities do, again, outside of Washington, D.C. You put metro stops in and you put in development right around there, density within those circles. What's the purpose of that? The purpose is to get out of that TIMI problem, where you want people to be able to walk to the places they need to go or take public transit to where they need to go and not have to take their automobiles. So that's what's happening. Is municipalities and transit authorities put in subway stops. The municipalities say, we will allow dense building around these places. This is one of the options that communities have undertaken as a solution. This is the attempt in Boston to do this. This right here is the Green Line in Boston. It's one of the transit ways. This is a parking lot, a commuter parking lot. People used to drive there and go in. What they decided to do was to put in this building over that. The idea being that these people now live right by the transit station. They can walk out, get on the train, and shoot downtown to go to work. And actually, this is a great thing to do. Particular problem with this might be that they can't, you might notice if you look at this, they can't really walk anywhere else unless they want to play golf. There's no place to shop, no restaurants, nothing else around there. But it's a start. The cities are trying to do these kinds of things. And then finally, you know, I just wanted to mention parking lots because we have these everywhere, especially around Ithaca. What do? They do many things, but in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, they trap heat. When you have a lot of heat, you need to cool it. What municipalities do is they require some places to put in green, and this cools, you know, the tarmac, cools the community a bit. They've been noticing in Atlanta, 10-degree difference between a treeless airport and a nearby green neighborhood, okay? So communities that undertake these urban canopy programs actually get the opportunity to reduce, or are trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that way. So this sets up what I'm interested in researching. Okay, why would a community act on issues of global sustainability? Okay, typically decision makers in these communities have to worry about short political cycles, getting elected every 2 or 4 years. They have to worry about the budget this year and next year, taxes, delivering local services. But with the as you all know, if you think about sustainability, you think about global commons issues, you incur costs today within your municipality, and the benefits are dispersed around the globe, okay? And they're in the long term. You know, even if I save Greek Peak by mitigating my greenhouse gas emissions, that might not be noticeable for 5, 10, or 20 years down the line. And it might even be further away than Greek Peak. It could be wineries in California or islands in the South Pacific. So this is the typical global commons problem. And the way commons problems have typically been done, and the way they've tried to take care of climate change, was a top-down solution. Okay, the federal government tells the states what to do, the states tell the municipalities what to do, and they all march towards a solution. And this top-down way is very bureaucratic. It's a one-size-fits-all solution, but it has worked. Okay, this has done a lot in terms of cleaning up early successes. So now we no longer put terrible amounts of sewage into our waterways because the federal government said we need to clean these up. And they ordered us to do it, told us how to do it, and the top-down solution worked. Another way, this is the way advocated by the mayor in my first slide, was this sort of bottom-up decentralized system. This idea that municipalities, for their own reasons, because they compete with each other for residents, because they compete with each other for business, will do these kinds of things and on their own march towards environmental protection. And this is very big now, especially in this country, because localism is highly prized in this nation. So the idea that a local government will act on its own to protect the greater good is something that is talked about quite a bit. And it has worked. We have Tompkins County doing something. We have, climate action in Binghamton and in Boston. And then this idea of multi-level governance, this co-production of policy, this idea that we can't have top-down solutions perhaps, but we can't have bottom-up solutions. Individual municipalities may act. The top-down may provide capacity. They may provide regulations, so they may just provide goals. But there's feedbacks. So municipalities work together. Those of you who are familiar with the ICLEI network recognize that as a network between municipalities. Okay, there might be feedback going up the chain. So all of a sudden municipalities are saying to states, let me do something this way. Let me try local innovation. And then you have these non-governmental actors, as we just heard about in Tompkins County, that can provide some of the glue, can provide some of the expertise, okay? So these are the three ways that commons issues are thinking about in the literature being tackled. So I wanted to start to investigate exactly how that might come about. What factors will influence local climate change? What kinds of communities do this? Okay, so this is the first part of the research that I did. And it's based on a survey that was done of, eventually I had 1,841 municipalities, and it looked at a whole range of things. It was done by the International City County Management Association. And I was zeroed in on these series of questions that asked about whether or not communities plan for climate change. I looked at external factors in my analysis, whether or not there was a state climate plan, which doesn't require that municipalities do anything, but which I believe maybe creates some sort of environment along those lines. And the same way the state participation in these handful of regional networks where things tend to, states talk state to state about things. Those are the external factors. Then I looked at these internal factors. Are they a city, a suburb, or rural? What's the local politics, the local government structure, the economic structure, capacity? Okay, so I put all these into the computer, and it spit out this. Okay, everyone read this? Okay, I'll summarize this for you in these 5 bullets. Basically, surprise, surprise, bigger places do more. Are more likely to act. It is more likely New York City will do something, all things considered, than in Ithaca. It's more likely Ithaca will do something more likely than Trumansburg, okay? External factors are important. So here this is hinting at me that perhaps there is this state role there is a role for higher level government somewhere in this picture, okay? Capacity is crucial. Again, this doesn't surprise us. Municipalities have to have the money or the resources or the technical expertise to get something done. More democratic places have tended to act on this. And economic structure is not as important as I had thought it might be. This idea that it's the economy versus the environment is not playing out by and large. Most places are able to navigate both, except smaller places. And again, that's probably expected because if you're a one company town and that company happens to be a polluting industry, you're likely to have attitudes along those lines and not worry or not deal with climate change quite as much. So then that brought to the second part of the research that I was doing is why do those communities act? Okay, those are the kinds of communities that act. Why did these communities act? And most places looked at this kind of a community. Boston, most studies do this. I'm interested in where most Americans live, smaller towns, not the elite cities. So what I did was I took my statistical analysis and I picked out those places that were least likely to act, but did. Okay, and you can do that statistically. The computer will do it for you, put in a few commands, and it ranks whether or not they should have done something. And I just picked those that should not have done something, but actually did do something. And so I started interviewing places, and this is the first dozen places where I've interviewed the city managers or city planners. And I won't go through all of them, but you see they tend to be smaller. They're not the Bostons. They're barely, well, there's a couple bigger than Ithaca, but they're barely the Ithacas. They tend to be a little bit poorer. They tend to be a little bit less, the populace hasn't attained education as many places have, and they're not particularly democratic. In fact, some really didn't vote for Gore very much at all. Yet they all did something about climate change. And why did that occur? What were the reasons driving that? And basically, we've come down to this 7 reasons so far, okay? And this is, and you obviously can pick multiple drivers, which is why there were only 12 communities, but there are more than 12 drivers. Saving money was the big one. Okay, that's no surprise. We'll talk about that in a second. Interesting, the ethic of the officials in the community was interesting as well. So that's the planning department or the city manager saying, this is important to me, to our future. I will put this on the agenda. So that entrepreneurial leader within a community turned out to be important. Citizen ethic was also important. It was mentioned a number of times. It was never the number one issue, but it was in a place where people like it's like Ithaca. Oh, the community expects this kind of thing to be done, and so we respond to that. We're a college town. We're a place that has another big governmental institution, so we're used to that. I'll talk about economic development goals in a second. Regulation on municipal utilities is what this is for. This was a surprise. Out of the 12 places that I called, 5 of them had municipal utilities. And because, by virtue of that fact, they had other top-down regulations impacting them. And so that's how they got into the whole climate change thing. And then there's local impact I'll talk about in a second. And grant chasing is just one place just saw a pool of money and said, hey, if we do something about climate change, we can get some money for it. And so they went after it. Though everybody uses external funds to fund their climate change program, only one said use that. That was a driver for only one community. So in terms of saving money, this is the most common thing, this idea of a co-benefit. This is why people think a lot of the action will happen by cities, because they will recognize these co-benefits, that they're really all about saving money and balancing the budget. And if you can save the planet at the same time, great. This wasn't part of my study, New Haven, Connecticut, but these numbers are illustrative, okay? And these are 5, 6, 7 years old when I got these. But they invested $17.5 million in energy efficiency throughout the city and saved $24 million. So they made a $7 million profit on their investment. So that's what drives some of this action, okay? Economic development. This was really interesting. In one of my communities in Columbus, Wisconsin, they actually hired a sustainability director and one person, sustainability economic director. And their idea was this person, being green, would set them out from the other competitors, from the other communities. Okay? And they would say, and it's worked so far. They believe about 50% of their new investment has come from communities, from companies that share the ethic, that share the same ethic that they have. Local climate change impact. This is not a surprise either. But, and maybe we'll hear more and more about this with Hurricane Sandy and other things, but in Homer, Alaska, they saw the spruce bark beetles decimating their forests. And in Loveland, Ohio, they started realizing that they had a mild winter, they had a drought. What's going on? It started them thinking about it. It drove them towards planning and some kind of action. So, to bring us to a conclusion, do cities pass the test? Will they lead us from the bottom up to climate change mitigation and protection? Okay, the answers are never clear. On the yes side, there are internal drivers, these ideas of economic development, saving money, etc., and some cities are acting. But the reality is most cities do not act. State action is helping them in some way, so there is this other role there. And cities are facing these large capacity constraints, particularly now. They can barely take care of their police and their teaching responsibilities. And here they have to, we're asking them to stop thinking about these other costs. So what I'm starting to conclude is we can't wait for cities to act, okay? I mean, I think there's a lot of people thinking, well, let's just see what happens. Let's do this in a polycentric, decentralized manner, and places like Tompkins County will pull us along. But the reality is this is a fairly rare place. Top-down regulation is not the way to do it because that's too clunky for most places. There's no subtlety there anymore. But national guidance is important. This idea that in a multi-level governance system, the upper level governance can give incentives, capacity, authority, but still allow local innovation to occur. Because what works in Ithaca will not work in Trumansburg. But they both might be pushing towards the same goals. And as was talked about in the earlier, so I won't get into it, local level is where support for these ideas is built because people tend to trust their local officials more than they trust their state or federal officials. So this is where I'm going now and starting to talk more and more about in terms of climate change and general sustainability. And I would love to have a discussion with people about whether or not they think this is out to lunch or that this is the way we need to go. Thank you very much.
Now the discussion is open. You can ask the questions for the speakers.
I guess I wanted to just point out the mayor's last name. George Hartwell, just like right out of a Dickens novel. He's a great guy. I've been on panels with him. I've heard him speak at keynote addresses. I've been to Grand Rapids, seen what they've done. I've read about it in the book, and it's really a model for how a city, the Rust Belt city, really down on its luck, decided it was going to move forward into the future on the basis of sustainability, clean energy, and dealing with climate change. And it's really turned the whole place around. Really fascinating place to take a close look at.
And I met him at a Mayor's Innovation Conference. So he's the kind of entrepreneurial leader that most places don't have, unfortunately. But that's where I ran into him, and so that sort of fits in exactly with what's happening here.
Have either of you given this talk to Day Hall and the Cornell Board of Trustees? Good. That's the first question. The second question is, what's your prognosis for Roosevelt Island? Okay.
I have no idea. Yeah.
I have conversations with people in Day Hall on a pretty regular basis. One of the interesting things, and this is just anecdotal, but I've felt a real shift in focus down to New York City, and it's been disconcerting. I can't get anybody in Day Hall to think about buying wind power from Black Oak, which just astounds me. Because they said it's too expensive. Ithaca College is buying wind power from us. How can it be not too expensive for Ithaca College, but too expensive for Cornell? I just don't get it. I mean, Ithaca College actually allowed their energy manager to be on the board of Black Oak Wind Farm. We never would. I mean, that just wasn't even in the realm of possibility at Cornell. And as for Roosevelt Island, take a look at that. I mean, what happened in this last event with Sandy? I mean, the storm surge came from both the north and the south. I mean, Roosevelt Island was right in the middle. It comes from the north because it comes through the north shore of Long Island, right? And then it goes around and down the East River. And then, of course, it comes up to New York Harbor. It goes up the East River. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch. I think they can do it if they're planning on 6 feet. But what if it goes to 60 feet?
So, what's an interesting side story is I'm starting at Binghamton University this fall. They built a new building in downtown Binghamton for this. You know, it's not out on the Vestal campus. And a couple of years after it started, it's a brand new building. A couple of years after it opened, it was lost. Use of it was lost for a year because of the flooding. As that flooding was rolling in, the builders of student housing next door saw what was happening and shifted their plans in progress and raised everything up so that they are building things up higher in preparation, you know, recognizing whether or not it's climate change, but recognizing that this happens and may happen more frequently, and why do they want to put their investment at risk? And they did not fix the building apparently at Binghamton University as much as they should have, they told me. But.
So I'm a scientist, and when I talk with people in the climate change community, so at national conferences, I've been frustrated by many people really being like waiting for federal level regulation. You know, so a lot of people are convinced that the problem is so large that, you know, if we really don't sort of push and get the federal level legislation, it's sort of hopeless. And I feel like I'm always an advocate for, well, you know, let's embrace all of these local initiatives. So I'm really happy to see your analysis. What is your experience in working with the sort of climate scientists, or do you get that sense from the climate science community that they're not giving enough feedback to the local movements? I'm familiar with some of the work out in Seattle, sort of the climate impacts group has been very involved in the Pacific Northwest as like a great example of feedback between climate modelers and actual city planning, but are there enough examples of that?
So there aren't enough because not every city is doing this. I do know in Homer, Alaska, one of the things that they benefit from is federal scientists up there working with them. So both on climate and on the invasive species and things like that. So I do know that that does happen, as you said, in these cases. I have not looked at that to say whether or not it's widespread. I suspect there's more town-gown cooperation happening, or that's the place where it could be.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I mean these things are so complicated, and I think it does sort of boil down to all of the above. But I think in terms of at the regional level, that if we move towards a new paradigm, move beyond town versus gown to what I refer to as campus community collaboration, I think there's a lot of really important stuff that can come out of that can serve as a model going forward. Not just in college towns either, but just developing that whole ethos of creating gardens and moving away from silos. That whole notion of connecting and collaborating is something that needs to permeate the whole culture to solve these problems.
Okay, so George, your slide, I thought it was great where you did the thing about the jurisdictions which wouldn't have been expected to do a lot, but did a lot. And that's a tremendous insight. And you had a slide up there where you looked at the factors, or you identified factors that caused them to do more than otherwise would have been expected, right? So what would it take? What would you say if I was the president's advisor on climate change? And the president has mentioned this now in his State of the Union speech. And there is speculation that this is like the big push for the second term, looking for legacy and all beyond gun control. So what would you say you could do as a matter of federal policy to increase the probability that more jurisdictions that were improbable become probable?
So there's going to be a huge laundry list, but there are other ways that cities have invested, that the federal government has looked at how cities do things. So maybe there is this idea of setting goals, setting standards and providing grants. I mean, they did have for a while a Sustainable Communities Block Grant Program, which ran out of money and petered out, thanks to Congress. But maybe there are ways, I mean, the federal government has to provide capacity, fiscal and technical, because not every place has a university or has federal scientists who can collaborate. They can provide this coordinating role of, oh, look what Ithaca did. Maybe this can happen somewhere else. Maybe it won't, but it starts to give people ideas. I mean, they can, I think they can and should. I skipped over one case study here, the Rouge River watershed, but what they did in that case was the federal government came in and said, and this was for watershed management, not for climate change, they said, look, we can impose top-down authority on you, and we will, or you can come together and, and come up with a solution. And 48 communities did come together. And I'm thinking the other thing that has to happen is we have to, so it's not the federal imposing on the cities, there has to be more of a regional grouping. So one of my thoughts has been, and I didn't present it here, was that there are these greenhouse gas initiatives, state-to-state initiatives, okay? There's one in the Northeast. Those states are very much alike. They have similar politics, similar resources bases, similar ways of operating. Maybe that can be a group that the federal government says, okay, you guys don't produce coal, but use a lot of natural gas. Here is, some rules, some guidelines, some money to do this stuff. And I want you, with the power that you have in the state, to impose things on the cities to figure that out. And then you take, the Ohios, Pennsylvanias, and West Virginias, which if you put them into the Northeast Coalition would make the coalition very unstable, but they have their own resources, their own needs. You guys produce a lot of coal. Okay, that's not good. How are we going to change you economically? How are we going to clean the coal? All these kinds of things that could possibly happen.
And I think one of the things that George is pointing out there that's really important to recognize is the diversity of energy infrastructure in the country. So it's I think one of the reasons why we have so much trouble coming up with a national energy policy is because the energy regimes are so different from one region to another in the United States. One of the things I would say, if in an ideal world, a carbon tax would do it, and it has. In Australia, for example, they imposed a national carbon tax in July. The average price of electricity there is now 28 cents a kilowatt hour. The whole country has switched over in a matter of months to LED lighting. Totally permeated the marketplace. So the idea that we can't do anything about this is just wrong-headed. We can. But short of that, which I don't think is going to happen with this current Congress for some reason, I think finding ways to unlock the potential of public-private partnerships is really important. I think Governor Cuomo is on the right path here. There are billions of dollars sitting on the sideline waiting to get invested in infrastructure. And not just energy infrastructure, not just water infrastructure, but a whole slew of areas, all of which would help make these communities more resilient.
Yeah, so just a quick comment. I know a lot of people in this room have been studying these issues for a long time, thinking about them, myself included. When do you reach a point, though, a simple devil's advocate question, you reach a point where you stop thinking about mitigation and shift the focus to adaptation?
I think many communities are going down that path, and I think that's fine because that localizes it. I think there's two things. One, it's a less interesting question to me because if I'm Binghamton and I get flooded, I want to do something about the flooding, building my buildings up, and that's fine. I also think in some ways, I don't want people to give up because, there is something bad coming, but it could be somewhat worse if we don't undertake mitigation strategies. And, so I don't think you stop thinking about mitigation and switch to adaptation. I think you always do both. And I'm studying mitigation, so that's why you see me talking just about that.
I think we've reached the point because there's so much climate change that's already baked in. We all know that. That we need to understand that whatever mitigation we do now is part of adaptation. That they aren't separate one from the other. That this is about trying to figure out how to keep a really bad situation from getting catastrophic. So we have to, this is tough for human beings, two things at the same time. But, this is what our survival depends on.
I have a quick comment. George, you talked about the cities taking actions on climate change, but for me, it's are all low-hanging fruits because the basic problem in America is that the city design and they have not been designed to be public transport friendly. And your data showed that I think more than 1/3 or half in many cities the greenhouse gas emissions are from transport. So what are we doing to change the urban design, which will ultimately impact on the
As a nation, not very much. In particular places, they're trying. So up in Syracuse, the county manager for Onondaga County had hoped to focus development into the city and not into the suburbs and into the rural areas. The problem she ran into, which is the problem that I'm studying, is that these other communities said, no, this is our future, our tax base that you're cutting into. So I mean, so that's an example of how it's not happening. I know in Ithaca, and I know this is driven by development interests, but there's a lot of interest in increasing density in the city. And hopefully you increase density here, you don't get it out in other parts of the county. Now it doesn't always work because other parts of the county, they have their own agendas. But the fact is, as you said, if we don't do this together, we can't do this individually. And what we still are doing is these 1,500 municipalities in New York State are by and large working individually. And that is the big problem. So the answer is we're not doing enough to change that. Sorry. Go ahead.
And I just think that's one of the hopeful things about this NYSERDA award to the local planning department, to work with the 8 other counties in the southern tier and those municipalities to create a strategic plan for greener, cleaner development. And so I think what we've got to do is, and this is basic. You got to start where the work's already being done and build out. And that may be in unexpected places like Kearney, Nebraska, which is great. I've been to Kearney. My wife's from Nebraska. It's great to hear that's one of the communities that's involved in this. But we have to start where the energy is and then move out from there. And if we don't, it's going to stall. And I think one of the things I would say is really watch what happens here in the city of Ithaca in particular over the next few years. I was at a dinner last night, downtown business leaders, a couple hundred people, mayor rolling out his vision for downtown densification. We have close to $1 billion of construction taking place that in the pipeline right now, not just theoretical. And it's all being really thought through carefully in terms of these issues around transportation and densification and mixed use. And I think that it's very promising. I was very optimistic and hopeful when I walked away from this dinner last night.
And I guess my final thought would be, that's awesome, and I hope that continues, but my fear is that it's not going to grow beyond very many places because they don't have the communities. I mean, and that's what I'm looking at, and that's what the research is starting to say, and I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's about social capital in the end.
It's about people understanding
capital.
these things, but that's why I think we need to have these different layers playing in the state of New York, giving grants and saying things like that.
So if this, actually we don't have more time, it's 1:30, and thank you for this excellent presentation.